"Get out of here, old woman," my daughter shouted, not imagining what that phrase would awaken. I swallowed my tears, climbed the stairs, and opened the folder I had kept for 20 years. There were the documents, the receipts, the evidence, and the beginning of the end for them. The next morning, the house was officially mine, and they had 24 hours to leave. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The rain pattered against the bedroom window as Eleanor heard the conversation in the living room. She didn't need to strain to hear her son-in-law Richard's words, who spoke in that controlled, almost whispering voice he always used when trying to appear respectful while being cruel. "Melissa, you need to understand that the situation can't continue like this. Your mother is already 72 years old, retired for so long. It's not natural for a woman her age to live depending on her children." Eleanor continued folding her clothes, pretending not to hear. She had learned over the years that the best way to discover the truth about people was to let them speak when they thought they weren't being heard. "But Richard, she raised me alone after my father passed away. She was always a dedicated mother, worked as a teacher for 30 years to give me a dignified life." Melissa's voice sounded hesitant, as if she were trying to convince herself of something. "Exactly. She's already done her part. Now it's time for you to live your own life. We're a couple, we have our plans, our dreams. How are we going to build our family with her always here? Have you thought about that?" Eleanor sighed softly. In the last 2 years since Melissa got married, the atmosphere in the house had gradually changed. Richard had always been polite to her, never rude, but there was something in his eyes that she recognized. It was the same look she saw in some troublesome students during her years of teaching, those who smiled to her face but did mischief behind her back. "But where will she live? We don't have money to pay rent for her, and her retirement is very low." Melissa tried to argue, but Eleanor could tell there wasn't much conviction in her voice. "There are government programs, homes for the elderly, those kinds of things. Or maybe some distant relative could help. The important thing is that she needs to understand she can't depend on us forever." Eleanor closed her eyes. Home for the elderly. After a lifetime dedicated to her daughter, after having given up relationships, trips, personal dreams, to ensure Melissa had everything she needed, this was how she would be rewarded. She remembered when Melissa was little and got sick. Eleanor would spend entire nights awake caring for her, taking her to the doctor, missing work when necessary. She remembered the sacrifices she made to pay for her daughter's private college, how she even sold her few pieces of jewelry to ensure Melissa had a quality education. "You're right, honey. Maybe it is time for her to seek her independence." Melissa's voice now sounded firmer, as if she had finally found the justification she was looking for. Eleanor opened the dresser drawer and took out a folder she had kept for years. Inside, carefully organized documents, some yellowed by time, others more recent. She smiled slightly, seeing the first document, the deed to a small plot of land she had bought years ago when she was still teaching. With money she saved penny by penny. At the time, Melissa was a teenager and more interested in clothes and outings with friends than understanding her mother's financial decisions. Eleanor never bothered to explain. After all, she considered that her daughter should focus on her studies. She leafed through other documents, the certificate showing she had paid off the small apartment where they lived in just 10 years, when most people took 30 to pay off a mortgage. The proof of monthly deposits she made into a savings account that Melissa didn't even know existed. The partnership contract for a small company she had created with her initials, ELS Investments, that she managed discreetly. "Mom?" Melissa's voice brought her back to reality. Her daughter was standing at the bedroom door with an expression that mixed embarrassment and determination. "Yes, dear?" Eleanor quickly put away the documents and turned to her daughter with the gentle smile she always used. "We need to talk." Eleanor nodded, and the two headed to the living room, where Richard was waiting on the couch, fiddling with his phone, as if the conversation that was about to happen was just a detail in his day. "Mum, Richard and I have been thinking about our situation here at home." Melissa sat down next to her husband, who didn't raise his eyes from his phone. "We think maybe it's time for you to find your own place to live." Eleanor looked at her daughter, then at her son-in-law, who had finally put away his phone and was looking at her with an expression that tried to appear understanding. "My own place?" Eleanor repeated as if she didn't understand what was being said. Yes, Mum, you're already an independent woman. You have your retirement and we need our space as a couple. Eleanor nodded slowly, as if processing the information. I understand. And have you thought about any specific place? Richard spoke up. There are great options, Mrs. Sanders. Specialized residences, small apartments for rent. I'm sure you'll adapt very well. Specialized residences. Eleanor repeated the word, savoring each syllable. You mean nursing homes? They're not nursing homes, Mom. They're modern places, with activities. Other people your age. You might even make new friends. Melissa tried to sound excited, but Eleanor could sense the discomfort in her voice. I understand. Eleanor rose slowly, as if the weight of age made each movement an arduous task. You're right, of course. I can't be a burden forever. You're not a burden, Mrs. Sanders. Richard used that tone Eleanor knew well, condescending and fake. It's just a matter of autonomy. Autonomy. Eleanor smiled. What an interesting word. She walked to the window and stood watching the rain that continued to fall. 30 years as a teacher had taught her many things. One of them was that people frequently underestimated others' capacity for observation and intelligence, especially when those others were elderly women. How much time do you think I need to get organized? She asked without turning around. Well, there's no rush, Mom. You can take all the time you need. Melissa sounded relieved that Eleanor had accepted so easily. Would a month be enough? Of course, Mrs. Sanders, a month is perfect. Richard couldn't disguise the satisfaction in his voice. Eleanor turned to them, still with that gentle smile she had used for decades. Then it's decided. In a month, I'll move out. She returned to her bedroom, leaving the couple in the living room. She could hear the relieved murmur of their voices, probably celebrating how easy it had been to convince her. She sat on the bed and opened the document folder again. This time she removed a sheet from the back. It was a rental contract, dated 5 years ago, signed by Richard Sanders Smith and Melissa Sanders Smith as tenants of the apartment where they lived. The owner's name was clearly specified, Eleanor Louise Sanders, represented by ELS Investments. Eleanor smiled. They had never asked why the rent was so low for an apartment of that size, in such a good location. They never questioned why they never received visits from the owner or the real estate agency. They never suspected that the gentle lady who lived with them was, in fact, the owner of the place where they lived. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. Dr. Julia, this is Eleanor, your former high school teacher. Everything okay? I need to schedule a meeting with you. It's about some legal matters I need to resolve. Julia Matthews had been one of her brightest students. Today she was a respected lawyer, specializing in real estate and family law. Eleanor had followed her career from afar, always proud of her development. Of course, teacher, it will be a pleasure to receive you. When would you like to come? Tomorrow morning, if possible. And Julia, I need this meeting to be absolutely confidential. Naturally, teacher. You can count on me. Eleanor hung up the phone and looked again at the documents spread out on the bed. 30 years of teaching had taught her patience, strategy, and most importantly, that the best way to educate someone was to let that person face the consequences of their own actions. She carefully put the documents back in the folder and placed it back in the drawer. Tomorrow would begin the second phase of her life, a phase where she would no longer be just the dedicated mother and the tolerant mother-in-law. She would be Eleanor Louise Sanders, businesswoman, property owner, and a woman who had been underestimated for too many years. She looked out the window. The rain was lessening and some rays of sunlight were beginning to appear between the clouds. She smiled to herself. After so many years taking care of others, the time had finally come to take care of herself. Eleanor woke before the sun rose, as she had done for decades. The difference was that, for the first time in years, she felt renewed energy running through her veins. She prepared her coffee as always, but today there was a different purpose in each gesture. At 8 o'clock in the morning, she was at Julia Matthews' law office. The place was elegant, with walls lined with law books and a privileged view of the city. Julia, now a 40-year-old woman, successful and respected, received Eleanor with the same affection as always. "Teacher, what a pleasure to see you. How are you?" Julia hugged Eleanor with genuine joy. "You know, not a month goes by that I don't remember your literature classes. You taught me to love words. And I see you've learned to use them very well, dear." Eleanor smiled, settling into the armchair in front of Julia's desk. "But today, I didn't come here to talk about the past. I need your professional help." Eleanor opened her folder and began showing the documents to Julia, who examined them with growing surprise. "Teacher, I had no idea you had all these investments, this company, these properties. It's impressive. Julia, for 30 years I taught young people like you to question, to think, to not accept things at face value. Unfortunately, my own daughter never applied these lessons at home." Eleanor sighed. "Do you remember Melissa? Of course, we were in the same class. She was always a nice girl, but complacent. She never questioned where the money for her needs came from, never took an interest in financial matters, never asked how I managed to maintain our standard of living on a teacher's salary." Eleanor leafed through the documents, and now, married to a man who clearly influences her, she decided it's time to put me in a nursing home. Julia was shocked. "A nursing home? But teacher, you're completely lucid, independent." "Exactly, and that's why I need your help." Eleanor showed the rental contract. "Look, Julia, 5 years ago when Melissa got married, they looked for an apartment to live in. I discreetly bought this apartment through my company and rented it to them for a symbolic amount. They don't know you're the owner. They never questioned it. They believe they found an exceptional deal in the real estate market." Eleanor smiled ironically. "Richard, my son-in-law, always boasted about his ability to find good opportunities." Julia studied the documents with professional attention. "Teacher, technically they're in default. Even though it's a low amount, they haven't paid rent for 6 months. I know. I've been forgiving month after month, always coming up with an excuse not to charge them. But now that they want to kick me out of the house, I think it's time to be more rigorous with contractual obligations." "Do you want me to execute an eviction action?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, Julia, I want something more educational. I need you to regularize the entire legal situation of my company, update the contracts, and mainly, help me document everything properly. Document in the sense of protecting my rights, and at the same time teaching an important lesson about respect and gratitude." Eleanor leaned forward. "Julia, during all these years I've been observing my son-in-law. He's not an honest person." Eleanor told Julia about the conversations she overheard, about how Richard talked about her when he thought she wasn't around, about the disrespectful comments and the way he manipulated Melissa. "Last night, after I went to my room, I heard an interesting conversation between them. Richard was explaining to Melissa how easy it would be to get a judicial interdiction, claiming I have mental problems." Eleanor took a small recorder from her purse. "Fortunately, I've always been a cautious person." Julia listened to the recording with an increasingly serious expression. Richard's voice was clear. "Melissa, you don't understand. If we can prove that your mother no longer has the mental capacity to manage her own assets, we can assume guardianship. Imagine how many things she must have stashed away, how many savings. Old teacher ladies always have hidden money. This is very serious, teacher. Attempting fraudulent interdiction is a crime." "I know, dear, but I don't want to prosecute them. I just want them to learn a lesson." Eleanor put away the recorder. "I need you to help me do this the right way." For the next 2 hours, Eleanor and Julia planned a detailed strategy. Julia would draft all the contracts, regularize the company's situation, prepare the necessary documentation, and most importantly, help Eleanor conduct a formal meeting with the couple. "Teacher, are you sure you want to go down this path? It could be very painful for Melissa." "Julia, sometimes pain is necessary for growth. I taught that to hundreds of students over the years. The difference is that now I need to teach it to my own daughter." Eleanor returned home in the early afternoon, finding Melissa in the kitchen preparing lunch. Her daughter seemed more cheerful than in recent days. "Hi, Mum, how was your morning?" "Very productive, dear. I went to resolve some pending matters." Eleanor sat at the table. "Melissa, can I ask you a question?" "Of course, Mom. Are you up to date with the rent for this apartment?" Melissa hesitated for a moment. "Well, Mom, we're going through some financial difficulties, but it's temporary." "Financial difficulties?" "Richard is between jobs at the moment, and my salary alone doesn't cover all the expenses, but he already has some interviews scheduled." Eleanor nodded understandingly. "And how long have you not been paying the rent?" "About 2 or 3 months, maybe." Melissa couldn't maintain eye contact with her mother. 2 or 3 months, Eleanor repeated, knowing that it was actually 6 months. "And the owner isn't charging you?" Well, the real estate agency said he's an understanding person who understands the tenant's difficulties. How lucky you are, Eleanor smiled. Such a generous owner. Richard arrived in the middle of the afternoon, greeting Eleanor with his usual artificial politeness. Mrs. Sanders, how are you? Have you started looking for options for your move? Not yet, Richard, but I'm organizing myself. Eleanor observed him carefully. By the way, I heard that you're having some financial difficulties. Richard's face stiffened slightly. Nothing we can't resolve, Mrs. Sanders. They're just temporary adjustments. Of course, I understand. Difficulties happen to everyone. Eleanor stood up. Well, I'm going to rest a bit. Tomorrow I have some important commitments. In her room, Eleanor called Julia. Julia, I need you to accelerate the preparations. I want to schedule the meeting for the end of the week. Almost everything is ready, teacher. But can I suggest something? I think it would be interesting to invite the building manager as a witness. He knows the resident's situation well. Excellent idea. And Julia, one last thing. I need you to discreetly investigate my son-in-law's professional situation. I have some suspicions. Suspicions about what? About his honesty. Richard has always been very vague about his jobs, always changing fields, always with confusing explanations about his activities. I'd like to know exactly what his situation is. Julia agreed and promised to have a complete report by the end of the week. Eleanor hung up the phone and lay down on the bed. For the first time in years, she wasn't worried about the future. She was eager for it. She had spent decades being the understanding mother, the tolerant mother-in-law, the woman who always gave in, who always understood, who always forgave. But the time had come to be Eleanor Louise Sanders, the woman who had built a patrimony on her own, who had created a company, who had invested with intelligence and planning, the woman who had been underestimated for too long. She looked out the window and saw Richard in the building's courtyard, talking on the phone with someone. Even from a distance, she could tell he was gesturing nervously, like someone having a difficult discussion. She smiled to herself. In a few days, she would discover exactly what kind of man her daughter had chosen to marry. And then finally she could show Melissa that some of life's lessons aren't learned in school, but by facing the consequences of our own choices. The week would be interesting. Very interesting. The week passed quickly, and Eleanor observed Richard's every move with renewed attention. He left early in the morning, claiming to be looking for work, but always returned in the early afternoon with an altered mood, frequently on the phone with conversations that seemed tense. On Thursday, Julia called with information that confirmed Eleanor's suspicions. Teacher, the news about your son-in-law isn't good. Richard was fired from his last job 8 months ago, not 2, as he said. He was dismissed for embezzlement from the company. He wasn't prosecuted because he returned the money, but he was blacklisted in the market. Eleanor sighed. Continue, Julia. He has significant debts, credit card, payroll loans, even with loan sharks. I discovered he's been selling personal items to pay the most urgent debts. Personal items? Yes, some of Melissa's jewelry, electronics, even furniture, always with the excuse that he was optimizing the couple's assets. Eleanor closed her eyes. Poor Melissa. Always so naive, always so trusting of people. And there's more, teacher. Richard has been frequenting a somewhat suspicious law office. From what I could gather, he's really investigating the possibility of an interdiction. Interdiction? Yes, but not just for you. Apparently, he discovered that you have more assets than he imagined and is trying to find a way to access everything. Eleanor felt a mixture of anger and sadness. Anger at Richard's greed, sadness at seeing that her daughter was being manipulated by such an unscrupulous man. Julia, is everything prepared for our meeting tomorrow? Yes, teacher. I have all the documents organized. The building manager confirmed his presence, and I've prepared a summary of the entire legal situation. Great. And Julia, I need you to do one more thing. Prepare a complete report on Richard's debts with evidence. I want Melissa to see exactly who she's married to. On Friday morning, Eleanor woke up with a serenity she hadn't felt in years. She dressed carefully, choosing a sober but elegant outfit, and waited for the right moment. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was Julia, accompanied by a middle-aged man whom Eleanor recognized as the building manager. Melissa, Richard, can you come to the living room? I need to talk to you. The couple appeared, visibly confused by the presence of strangers. Mom, what's going on? Melissa asked, looking nervously at Julia. Please sit down, I'll explain everything. Eleanor waited for everyone to get settled. Melissa, Richard, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Julia Matthews, my lawyer, and Mr. John, our building manager. Richard immediately became alert. Lawyer? Mrs. Sanders, why do we need a lawyer? Well, Richard, since you decided it's time for me to look for another place to live, I thought it would be important to regularize some legal issues before my departure. Eleanor signaled to Julia, who opened a folder and began to lay out documents on the coffee table. First, I'd like to clarify the situation of the apartment where we live. Eleanor picked up a document. This is the rental contract signed by you 5 years ago. Melissa took the paper and read it quickly. Yes, it's our rental contract, but Mom, why are you showing this? Look at the owner's name, dear. Melissa read again, this time more carefully. Her expression gradually changed from confusion to shock. Eleanor Louise Sanders? She looked at her mother. But that means that... It means that your mother is the owner of this apartment, Melissa, Julia intervened professionally. Through the company ELS Investments, of which she is the majority partner. Richard was pale. This is impossible. Mrs. Sanders, you never mentioned... I never mentioned it because you never asked, Richard. For 5 years you believed you had found an apartment with rent below the market price out of pure luck. Eleanor showed other documents. Here are the proof of ownership, the company certificates, the bank statements, all properly registered and legal. Melissa was in shock. Mom, how is this possible? You always said you only had your retirement. I never said I only had my retirement, Melissa. You assumed that. Eleanor sighed. For 30 years as a teacher, I saved every penny I could. I invested in real estate, created a company, built a patrimony, all thinking about your future. But why did you never tell us? Richard tried to maintain his composure, but Eleanor could see the panic in his eyes. Because I wanted to see if you were capable of valuing what you had. Unfortunately, you failed the test. Eleanor picked up another document. Julia, can you explain the payment situation? Certainly. Julia addressed the couple. You have been in default for 6 months. The amount due with interest and penalties already exceeds $15,000. $15,000, Melissa repeated, incredulous. Yes, and that's without counting the costs of a potential lawsuit, Julia continued. Mrs. Sanders has every legal right to request immediate eviction, Richard finally exploded. This is a setup. You're trying to harm us. Me? Eleanor looked at her son-in-law with a serene expression. Richard, do you really think I set you up? Obviously, you planned all this, made fools of us all these years. Interesting that you use the word fools, Richard. Eleanor signaled to Julia. Dr. Julia, can you show the report on my son-in-law's financial situation? Julia handed a document to Melissa. Melissa, your husband was fired 8 months ago for embezzlement. He has debts exceeding $50,000 and has been selling your personal belongings to pay creditors. That's not true. Richard stood up abruptly. Here are the proof of sales, Richard. Julia showed several documents. Your jewelry, Melissa, was sold by your husband. He said you had agreed. Melissa looked at Richard with an expression of growing horror. You sold my grandmother's necklace? The ring my mother gave me? Melissa, I can explain. And there's more. Eleanor calmly intervened. Julia, can you play the recording? Julia turned on a small device and Richard's voice echoed through the room. Melissa, you don't understand. If we can prove that your mother no longer has the mental capacity to manage her own assets, we can assume guardianship. Imagine how many things she must have stashed away. How many savings. Old teacher ladies always have hidden money. The silence that followed was deafening. Melissa looked at Richard as if she were seeing a stranger. You were planning to put my mother in a home to steal her money. It wasn't stealing, Melissa. It was securing our future. Our future. Melissa stood up, trembling with anger. You sold my jewelry, lied about your job, you're in debt up to your neck, and you still wanted to put my mother in a home to rob her. Melissa, you don't understand the situation. I understand the situation perfectly, Richard. Melissa turned to Eleanor. Mom, I don't know what to say. I apologize for everything that happened. Eleanor stood up and hugged her daughter. Melissa, it's not your fault you were deceived, but you need to understand that choices have consequences. I know, Mom. I know. Melissa was crying. What's going to happen to us now? Eleanor looked at Julia, who presented a final document. I've prepared a settlement proposal, Julia explained. Mrs. Sanders is willing to forgive the rent debts and transfer ownership of the apartment to you, Melissa, with some conditions. What conditions? First, Richard must leave the apartment immediately. Second, you must initiate divorce proceedings. Third, your mother will have a lifetime right to live here if she so wishes. Melissa looked at Richard, who was clearly defeated. I accept the conditions. Melissa, you can't do this. We're married. We were married, Richard. Now we're just two people who made the mistake of meeting each other. Melissa turned to Eleanor. Mom, can you forgive me? Eleanor hugged her daughter again. I've already forgiven you, my dear. Now let's rebuild our life. Richard left that same day, taking only his clothes. In the days that followed, Melissa began to discover the extent of the lies and manipulations she had been subjected to. And Eleanor, finally, was able to show her daughter that strength and intelligence don't diminish with age, but can transform into wisdom and determination. 3 months passed since the day that forever changed the family dynamics. Eleanor watched Melissa through the kitchen window as her daughter tended to the plants on the balcony. There was a serenity in her movements that hadn't existed for years. Mum, do you want some coffee? Melissa entered the kitchen with a genuine smile that Eleanor hadn't seen in a long time. Yes, dear, sit here with me. Melissa prepared the coffee and sat at the table, as they had done every morning since Richard left. It was a simple ritual, but it had become precious to both of them. Mom, can I ask a question I've always wanted to ask, but never had the courage to? Eleanor smiled. You can ask anything, Melissa. How did you manage to build all this in secret? The company, the investments, the properties? How did I never notice? Eleanor laughed softly. Melissa, you were a child when I started investing. Later, when you grew up, you were more interested in your own discoveries, school, friends, relationships, and I thought that was better. But why in secret? Because I wanted you to be independent. If you knew I had money, maybe you wouldn't have tried so hard in your studies, wouldn't have developed your own career. Eleanor touched her daughter's hand. I wanted you to be strong on your own, not because of my money. Melissa nodded, understanding. And I ended up being dependent anyway, dependent on Richard's lies. You weren't dependent, Melissa. You were trusting. There's an important difference. Mom, can I know exactly what you own? Now that Richard is no longer here, I'd like to understand our real situation. Eleanor got up and went to get the document folder, which she now kept in the living room, no longer hidden in her bedroom. Well, let's see. Eleanor opened the folder. We have this apartment, which is now yours. I have 2 more apartments in this same building, both rented out. I have a beach house, which I bought 10 years ago, and a plot of land in the countryside that's worth a good amount. Melissa listened with growing amazement. ELS Investments has a portfolio of stocks and some fixed income investments. Nothing too risky, but enough to guarantee us a comfortable retirement. Guarantee us? Yes, dear. All of this is for you. I just manage it while I'm here. Melissa began to cry. Mum, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for believing Richard, for trying to kick you out of the house, for being so ungrateful. Eleanor hugged her daughter. Melissa, you weren't ungrateful. You were human. We all make mistakes when it comes to people we love. But I should have seen who he really was. Maybe. But if you had seen it, you wouldn't have learned the lesson you learned. Eleanor smiled. Now you know how to recognize fake people, how to question motives, how to value what you have. At that moment, the phone rang. It was Julia. Teacher, I have news about Richard. What kind of news? He tried to contest the apartment transfer, claiming he has rights as an ex-husband, but I discovered something interesting investigating his past. Eleanor put the phone on speaker so Melissa could hear. Richard has a history of relationships with older women or women with some assets. In the last 10 years, he's been married 3 times, always to women who had property or family with money. Melissa went pale. 3 times. Yes, Melissa. In all cases, he tried to appropriate his wife's assets. One of them was a widow, and he almost managed to have her committed, claiming mental problems. Oh my God. Melissa sat down heavily. So I really was just another victim? No, dear. Eleanor took her daughter's hand. You were the only one who managed to escape in time. Julia continued. Teacher, Richard is trying to sue you for manipulation and embezzlement. Obviously, it has no legal basis, but he's trying to intimidate us. Eleanor finished the sentence. Julia, can you handle this? I'm already handling it. I have enough evidence of his crimes to bury any attempt at a lawsuit. After hanging up, Eleanor and Melissa sat in silence for a few minutes. Mum, how did you always know about things? How were you always so smart? Eleanor laughed. Melissa, 30 years of being a teacher taught me to observe people. Teenagers are specialists in lying, manipulating, deceiving. I learned to recognize the signs. And why did you never teach me that? I tried, dear, but some lessons can only be learned by living. A week later, Eleanor was organizing some documents when Melissa came home from work with a different expression. Mum, I need to tell you something. What is it? Today I met with Claudia. Remember her? She was my friend in school. Eleanor nodded. She told me that Richard approached her about 2 months ago before all this happened. He was trying to discover information about our family, about what you had. Really? Yes. He said he was concerned about you, that he thought he needed to take better care of the family finances. Claudia thought it was strange and didn't say anything, but now she understands he was investigating. Eleanor shook her head. He really planned everything. Mom, there's one more thing. Melissa hesitated. Claudia told me that Richard commented about other elderly women in the building. He said some of them seemed to have money stashed away, and that it would be easy to gain their trust. Eleanor straightened in her chair. Other women in the building? Yes. He had his eye on Mrs. Antonia on the 4th floor and Mrs. Beatrice on the 2nd floor. Eleanor became thoughtful. Mrs. Antonia was a widow, had a good retirement and lived alone. Mrs. Beatrice was also a widow but had children who lived far away. Melissa, I need to talk to these ladies. Why, Mum? Because if Richard was planning to take advantage of them, I need to warn them. Women our age are easy targets for men like him. In the days that followed, Eleanor discreetly spoke with the 2 neighbors. Mrs. Antonia confirmed that Richard had tried to get close to her, always offering help with small household problems. Mrs. Beatrice said he had offered to help her with banking issues. Mum, you saved these women too, Melissa said admiringly. No, dear. I just shared an experience. They're intelligent and will know how to protect themselves. One afternoon, Eleanor was reading on the couch when Melissa arrived with a strange expression. Mum, I received a call from Richard. Eleanor looked up from her book. What did he want? He said he made mistakes, that he's sorry, that he wants to talk to me. And what did you say? I said I had nothing to talk about with him. But, Mum, he said something that worried me. What? He said you're not the person I think you are, that you're dangerous and that I should be careful. Eleanor laughed. Dangerous? Why does he think I'm dangerous? Because you defeated him, Mum. Because you showed that he wasn't as smart as he thought. Eleanor closed the book and looked at her daughter. Melissa, do you think I'm dangerous? No, Mom, I think you're strong. I think you always were, but I never realized it. And how do you feel knowing that your mother isn't just a retired old teacher? Melissa smiled. I feel proud and protected, and mostly I feel lucky to have such an intelligent mother. Eleanor stood up and hugged her daughter. Melissa, I want you to know something. Everything I did, all the investments, all the decisions were thinking of you. Even when you tried to kick me out of the house, I was still thinking about protecting you. I know, Mom. And now I also know that I'll never underestimate you again. Nor will I underestimate myself again. Eleanor smiled. You know what else? I'm thinking of expanding the business. Maybe it's time to show the world that elderly women aren't just gentle grandmothers. Do you have any plans? I always have a plan, dear. Always. 6 months later, Eleanor had created a financial guidance program for elderly women. Together with Julia, she developed workshops on asset protection, fraud prevention, and financial independence. The program became a success. Dozens of women discovered that they could be more than just mothers and grandmothers. They could be investors, businesswomen, owners of their own destiny. Melissa became a partner in her mother's company, learning about investments and administration. The relationship between them had never been so close and respectful, and Eleanor finally could be exactly who she always was. An intelligent, strong, and independent woman who had learned that sometimes you need to be underestimated to show all your power. One afternoon, while reviewing company reports, Eleanor received a call from Julia. "Teacher, I have news about Richard." "What news?" "He tried to pull the same scam on an 80-year-old lady in another neighborhood, but this time it didn't work." "Why not?" "Because she attended one of your workshops. She recognized the signs and called the police." Eleanor smiled. "See? Sometimes a well-taught lesson can save many lives." "Yes, teacher, and Richard was finally arrested. This time he won't be able to get away with it." Eleanor hung up the phone and looked out the window. Melissa was coming home from work, with a smile on her face and a company document folder in her hands. There was something deeply satisfying about watching her daughter grow, learn, become strong. There was something even more satisfying in knowing that her own strength had finally been recognized. Eleanor Louise Sanders was no longer just a retired teacher living in her daughter's shadow. She was a respected businesswoman, a mentor to other women, a proud mother, and most importantly, a person who had learned that it's never too late to show the world who you really are. And the best of all, she had discovered that being underestimated can be the greatest advantage of all. Dear listeners, we hope that Eleanor and Melissa's story has touched your hearts and shown that strength and wisdom have no age. This narrative teaches us that we should never underestimate the power of people, especially those who have dedicated their lives to caring for others. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally engaging and inspiring stories. You can find it by clicking here. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like on the video. Every day, we bring unique narratives that explore the complexity of life, family challenges, and the strength of the human spirit. Don't miss our upcoming content, as each story is a life lesson. We await you in the comments to know what you thought of Eleanor's transformation and if you've experienced similar situations. Until the next story.